Okay, so we're going to talk about how to set up a class in iClicker, and I'm going to set up one of my classes to demonstrate this. Once you have an account, and you do need to create an instructor account first in iClicker, but once you have that, you would go to iClicker.com, click sign in, and when you sign in, it's going to ask you whether you're an instructor or student. You're going to be an instructor for this role. Enter with whatever username and password you created. It should end with oswego.edu. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed, but an email just went out from ls-oswego.edu telling us that any mail that comes that does not end in oswego.edu is spam, is a phishing message. So it's just kind of contradictory, but we'll leave it at that. So I'm going to enter here. Okay, so I'm going to sign in and I'm going to create a new course. And so if you already have courses, they're going to be listed here, but I'm going to create a new course. And here you have two options. It could be a full course or attendance only. If you're going to take attendance only, you probably don't need clickers and you don't need to have students do it. There's other tools you can do for that, but it is an option. And the nice thing about attendance only is it doesn't cost the college anything. It's free for students. With a full course, there is a cost of $4 per student, which is picked up by the college so far, and I hope that continues. But again, it is one way of taking attendance, and you could do that. But the main learning gains from using clickers come from actually using clickers, not just for attendance. So you then pick your course discipline, and mine is going to be economics, which is listed there. It wasn't the first time I got this. And this is going to be Echo 3. I'm trying to remember how. It's actually Introduction to Econometrics. I'm trying to remember the easiest way for students to find it. Generally, they can find it by the instructor name, though. Now, here, we could have it to have students search for it and self-enroll. That's if you're not using it integrated. Here, let's say students must be invited to the course, and we could see what that tells us there. The Learn More tells us that, it doesn't really matter, I don't think, because it's automatically going to show up anyway. Option 2 is we're going to do it through roster and grade sync, and we'll get to that. So we'll do that in a bit. So let's do it that way, and we'll invite students to the class. Well, actually, let them search for and self-enroll, but we'll also show another way of doing it. So the course ID is going to be Echo 312, and the term is going to be, this is optional, but it's nice to have it there. So spring 2026, I guess. This class meets Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, this is optional, but I'm going to put it in just so that students feel confident that they're in the right section. And this is 10:20 each day, 10:20 each day, and 10:20. And there we go. And now I'm going to create the course. So now it's going to be available for students to try to find it. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is to set up the course requirements. So I'm going to select this, and there should be an option here to, well, we could follow this and go through all the steps, but we just did that earlier. So what we're going to do now is just go to settings to get it. This is assuming you already have the app and you've already signed up. So this is a full course, but now up here we have some additional things. This is how you could share with them to join, and you could put that on your first slide the first time you use it. You could also download the QR code and add that to a slide, and so forth. But now that that's all there, and I guess this probably was there before, but I didn't notice. So we could set it up so that students could use physical clickers and as well as the mobile devices. Very few students have those anymore. But if you want to give them the option, if they could find that, they'd have to buy the device, the physical clickers, but you wouldn't be able to use a lot of question types. So I'd encourage you just to do mobile devices only, but you do have that option. Now, you do have the option of monitoring student focus, which will see whether students are staying connected. But, unless you're going to have constant clicker questions throughout the course, if you're going to have them do other things on their laptop, or if they're going to be typing notes or other things, are going to appear to be out of focus from the app. If you're only doing polling questions for the entire class, you could turn that on and it would tell you how often students jump to other activities on their laptop or on their mobile device. I generally don't turn that on. Now, if you choose, you can have it automatically generate attendance. But if you're going to score students' results, that's kind of already doing that. If they're getting some points for responding to questions, then you don't really need a separate thing. But if you are going to keep attendance, you could have it keep a separate attendance record. The only problem is if you try running this and students aren't there, it will show them as having missed a day. Or if you use it on the first day of class, which I usually do, and not everyone's connected, it will appear that they were absent because they haven't yet joined the class. But I like to demonstrate it, and I do send a note to them before the first day, asking them to sign in and sign up for the class. But if you do want to do it, you could choose to highlight this. It just shades them in and lets them know if they missed 3 or more classes or however many you want to add there. And you have the option of requiring and setting location for attendance. That's geofencing. It doesn't always work reliably. In small classes, it might very well work. In larger classes, there's going to be some students, even physically in the room, who might appear to be elsewhere. And it can easily be defeated, by the way, by students spoofing their location, their GPS location from other locations. And there's lots of apps that do that. A lot of mobile games and things, for example, people will use that to make it appear that they're participating, like Pokemon Go. People can appear to be in other countries or other cities or other locations. I generally don't find that very useful, but you're welcome to try it. I'm not going to take attendance with class sessions because I'm just going to use the scores. If they got a 0 in the gradebook for that day, that generally means they weren't there because there's going to have an option for any of that. Now, if you're using multiple monitors, if you're in a classroom, and I strongly prefer this, you could set it up so you could choose which screen it's going to be on. That's why I was a little slow when we did that, the session one before the, 2 before this, because it was trying to capture the other screen. The simplest thing is automatically capture the screen where the iClicker toolbar is, because that's what students are seeing. And if you set it this way, it's not going to ask you and delay the start of a poll. So that's a nice feature. And here, the image preview is it's going to show you when you're doing it, what is being displayed. I usually leave that so I see what is going to happen. Now, the next question asks whether you want to share what's on your screen to student devices when polling starts. This is something that faculty differ on. If you want everyone only to be able to answer when they're in class, you might want to not send a picture of the screen because they'll see your screen right on the display if you're using a projector. Well, it wouldn't be very meaningful if you weren't using a projector, but basically, if you want students to be able to see what the question is about, even if they're not physically looking at the screen, you can, well, you can just automatically whenever polling starts. Or you could do it at the end of polling, which would let them see the results after everyone's answered the question, or you can choose not to send it. I generally send the screen at that point. But now the next question is whether you want to show the class results as a histogram or as a list of results with 3 responses when polling ends. This I generally don't do. Now, if you're only going to ask a question and not revisit the question after some peer discussion, you could have it automatically go right to students so they can see the results. I generally don't do that. I generally will, again, see the results as they're coming in, either on a separate device, my smartphone often, sometimes a tablet, or if there's 2 windows, I'll have the results show up on the window that's not displayed on the projector. And then I'll only show the results after they've had a chance to discuss it and vote it again. And then I can go back and show them the initial histogram and then the new histogram, or the initial, relative frequencies of responses and so forth before and after. So that's up to you. These are the settings that I use. Now, if you're going to grade student work, there's two ways of grading, and you can use different combinations of those. One is you could provide session participation, where it's based just simply on how many questions they respond to. So if you want, you could choose to give them a certain number of participation points if they answer all of the questions, all but one question, at least three quarters, at least half of them, or at least one question. So you can do whatever you'd like with that. This is only grading them basically for being there and participating, which again, it does encourage students to be there, which is not a bad thing. But generally, I don't do that. I normally set this to 0, and then I score individual questions. Now, the way that works is there's two components to the score. One is the number of points for responding, and the other is the number of additional points for a correct response. Common settings for that are like 1 and 1 or 2 and 2. I tend to be a little bit more generous with that, and I give them 3 points for a response, and I give them 2 points for a correct response. So they get 100% on the question if they answer it correctly. They end up with 60% for that question if they answer it incorrectly. If you do 2 and 2, they would get 100%, or 1 and 1, they would get 100% or 50 points if they answer it incorrect. 100 points if they're correct, or 100% if they're correct, 50% if not. That's up to you. I try to give questions where roughly half the class will get them wrong, because I want them to be challenging and a bit more engaging that way. And, so that the answers are not obvious. And so that should be a total number of points of 5. There we go. It just hadn't updated. And in this case, it's scoring individual poll questions. Now, you could also set it up so that there's a fixed number of points each day. And in that case, if you ask 3 questions or ask 20 questions, it's going to give you a total number of points broken down in terms of percentage of correct responses. You could also do the same thing in the gradebook by treating each day equally. But if I'm giving twice as many responses, I don't mind them getting twice as much weight on that. So I don't use that option. I leave it at individual polling questions, sorry. But this would be the maximum number of points they could get. And that way, each thing would be the same percentage. And so they could just simply be added together. But you could also use weighted or unweighted averages, or however you want within Brightspace, to get either result, no matter which you choose. Okay, so if you're going to do short answer, you have the option of assigning correct responses, so it will automatically grade them. But in that case, you might want to group responses together, or it'll group them together, but you probably don't want capitalization to be a factor. So if you leave it set as a default of no, it means that whether you capitalize the answer or not, it's going to be marked the same way, and it's going to be grouped together. So you can see all the responses together. Now, the default on timer is to count up. And I find that doesn't work as well in most of my applications, because there's always some students who will just who like to take a long time for questions that may not require a long time. And it's kind of a stalling tactic. I'm not sure if it's done intentionally or if they're just being extremely cautious. Generally speaking, what I do is I count down, and normally I start from like 1.5 minutes and go down from there. It goes up by 30 or down by 30-second intervals, but you could type in other amounts. Normally, I start the class at 1 minute and 30 seconds, and then we'll drop it down lower, 1 minute, 30 seconds. So they got 1.5 minutes to answer. That's usually enough so that even if they're The wireless disconnects, they can get reconnected and respond. And what I do is I adjust the timing before I start the poll so that if it's a more complicated question, I might give them 2 or 3 minutes to work through it before the polling starts. But then they have, in this case, a minute and a half to get their responses in. They can answer as many times as they want, and only the last time it sticks. So whatever was the last entry that they made is what gets graded. So, if they're doing multiple choice, they could switch it around as many times as they want. But once the timer gets down to zero, that last answer is the one that's going to be graded. And I like this because it just puts a little bit of pressure on getting them to think, to build automaticity and to keep your time manageable, because some students might take 3 or 4 minutes for something that might be a simple definition, or it might be a very simple application. So if I have more complicated calculations or something that requires more thought, I just won't start the polling right away. But by doing this, they'll see the countdown, and then it gets larger, and I think it turns red once it gets down to 10 seconds, and it puts just a little more pressure on everyone to get it done in time period that's reasonable. When I have a small class, it may go down to a minute or so. In a larger class, I may drop it down to a minute 15 second or so. Generally, you can't get it much lower than that because of students having some issues connecting or switching over from one thing to the other, one app to another, etc. But so that's how I set up at least the polling. Quizzing, you probably don't need to do. This is if you're going to do a quiz separate from using the poll in class, because you could have quizzes where students go on their own. But if you're going to set up a quiz with a set of questions, you're probably better off doing that right in Brightspace. Or, you could use a Google form with a quiz or whatever. It doesn't really add that much doing this. You've got many more options for editing and so forth in Brightspace than you would with this. So we've done everything now except integrated it with class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to Brightspace, and it's going to ask me for permission to do this. And here I'm going to have to authenticate, and this will be a network login. And if I was already logged in, it would go a little bit faster, but I want to do this from scratch. So we're going to go down to SUNY as we go, and our fun multi-factor authentication. I'm going to log in the usual way. Okay, I was already logged in. Now, this will list all the classes it finds in Brightspace. It's not going to find my class yet because it defaults only to published classes. I have not yet gotten my class ready because my class isn't until the distant future of, say, Monday. So it is unpublished. So I'm going to select unpublished here, and I'm going to look for, here I can search by course name. I'm going to put in 312, and there we go. And this is going to be the 2026 version of the course. Next. And now there's 19 students, it's the smallest section I've ever had with this course, and I'm going to connect to this course. And it is now connected. Now, I would have the option of syncing the roster later and now, but I'm going to click on Sync Roster Now. And this is now going to load in all the students who are in my class. And you notice there were 18 students, 17 of them already had iClicker accounts. We use this pretty heavily in economics, and quite a few other classes do as well. So 18 of the 19 students already are used to using it. And this would show me the details of what that student is. Since this is being recorded, I won't display that. But what happens basically is you then have an option of sending them email telling them they need to download iClicker or to sign up for iClicker using the SUNY As We Go email address, or download the app, and this will help them get connected to the class. So I'm just going to click close. If I was doing this, without it being recorded, I would go through and do the rest. Now, it's now connected, but we still have to set up how we're going to be using it in Brightspace. There's basically two main options here, and the main ones are, do we want to have one score that will have all their iClicker activity together in a single column, or do we want to use individual activity scores in separate columns? I always choose this one. You can switch later if you started with the other one, but it's a little bit messier in terms of syncing. And the reason for this is I like to see how they did each day. And students like to see how they did each day. And this way you can go to your Brightspace gradebook and see what the scores are each individual day. And if they were missing classes, you can see the zeros or the blanks, depending on how you set it up in the gradebook. And you can use that as a trigger to send them reminders about being there and so forth. And here you could have separate, remember there was activity and performance points and so forth. Since I'm using only the performance points and not participation, I could leave it either at total points or participation points. If you're using both, you could display them only together, one or the other, or separate columns for each. I just use total points, which is for me is the same as performance points only. So either one doesn't matter in that case. But if you had both together, you probably would use total points, and then it would be a combination of just some points for being there and others based on how they responded. Some people will give just a flat number of points for being there, and then will only give credit for correct points, or again, some sort of a weighted combination of those. That's up to you. However, once you set it, it will be in effect until after you change it, and it will not change your grades retroactively. So if you're going to, it's best to think this through carefully before you use it the first time, because again, once this is set, it's going to stay until you set it, and it won't, you can't change it, for example, in the middle of class and have that apply. Okay, so if students have no responses, I always put in a score of 0 so they can see that they were not there. That makes it just a little bit more clear. The column name in Brightspace, it's not really going to make a difference. Here it's saying iClicker attendance. I normally put, I think, iClicker score because it's not just attendance. So I'll put iClicker score, and that will generate the gradebook columns. And then I'm just going to save that. And now my class is all set up and ready to use. And what I would do in order to use it in class, I would, well, if I'm in a classroom, if I'm in a classroom situation, it would be right on the desktop where you would click iClicker, and then it actually doesn't install each and every time. It's the only way they could set up for multiple users. And this popped up on my other screen, but here it is. You would log in as you normally would. So, except capitalization doesn't matter, I think. I'm not positive on that. It does certainly with the password. And I'm going to set this to remember me so I don't have to log in each time. In the classroom computers, you're going to have to do this each time anyway. And it will take about 5 to 10 seconds to download and install. And then once you're ready to go, you would click Start Class. I'm going to do this not with my class because otherwise it would show as missing a day. So you just click Start Class, and it's right up here. And when you want to do a poll, you select Poll. You choose what type of question it is. And then once you choose that, this is multiple choice, you click the arrow. Here I did not, because this session I did not set it to automatically record the screen. I'm going to record this screen, which it's on, click select, and then it's going to display that. And now if you were logged into that other session, you would see the question pop up. And this is, again, doing a count up instead of a count down. And when you're done, if you're doing the countdown, it automatically stops at 0. If you want to add more time, well, I think I can change that from here. So I'm going to change this to a countdown just so you can see it. I'm not sure whether it's going to count down from though. So let's try that again. Okay, it defaulted to 30 seconds. So it's going to count down. And once it gets down, we can make it speed up. You can decrease the time if everyone's finishing, except I decrease it too much. Let's go back again. I'll decrease it. No, it changes by 30-second intervals. So one more time. We'll let it count down just to see what happens when it gets down to 10 seconds. If they haven't changed it, it's going to highlight it once it gets down to 10 seconds. And if you're in a large class, you might want to remind students that they have the first couple of times there's 10 seconds remaining. And it doesn't do that anymore. They used to just get a little bit bigger and turn red, but they've added features and taken some away. And this, by the way, will just float above whatever you've got. So you could have PowerPoint, Google Slides, or any other app open, and it's just going to be there. If it gets in your way, blocking something, just move it somewhere else. And when you're ready to do a poll, just click on it again, expand it. And at any point, you could see your results. If you have a second screen, you could open the results in a separate window, drag it to the other screen so you can observe it and see the results as they're coming in. That's what I prefer to do when I'm in a classroom with two screens because I can see the results. Now, if I'm going to be wandering around at the time, you could log in on a mobile device because you could have the instructor version of this on an iPhone or an Android phone or something similar or a tablet, and then you could start and stop it. And it also has the ability to advance and go backwards with slide displays. So it becomes a remote and you could move around the classroom while still controlling this. And then when you're done, let's say we've done all the questions, you would, we can get rid of the results now. You would click this arrow, it would come down, you would choose, there's other tools in here, but we could just click end and it gives you the option of doing end of class poll, asking students how they're doing, basically a classroom assessment technique type of thing. And we're just going to end the class without that though. And then when you're done, you just close this. And then you would go back in, you would log in. We'll be there in a second for CPR, Rebecca. Sorry, I went a little bit long. And then you could select the answers, upload them to the gradebook. The only other thing I want to mention is it will not put the grades in a category. You have to manually create the category in the Brightspace gradebook, edit each one of the grades at the end of the class after they've been synced, and then just put that into the appropriate category and it all gets added. And Jessica, I've got to leave and we'll come right back. So sorry about that. Um, okay, I'll be right back with Zoom. And if you have any questions, Michael, we'll be there. And sorry, I'll exit. I'll be back in about 10 seconds after I stop.
Thank you.